Hello, I'm Paul Kelso, and I've been working on a story that Sky News has broken today regarding something generically known as the contaminated blood scandal. This is a story that has been rumbling for nearly 40 years, a dreadful case in which more than 2,400 people, haemophiliacs, so suffering from a blood condition that means the blood does not clot automatically as it should. 2,400 haemophiliacs had died from HIV virus, from AIDS or from hepatitis C, having been infected with those viruses through blood products that were contaminated with the viruses, that they were given with no knowledge that they were carrying these deadly viruses. The contaminated blood products, clotting agents largely, one called factor 8, which helps augment the blood's ability to clot. These were largely imported from the United States, where they were produced in circumstances that are quite horrifying when you stop and look into them. They were pooled products, not made from one donor's blood, but from multiple donors' blood, and this blood was bought on a commercial basis by the companies that were manufacturing the products, and it was sourced from the cheapest places they could possibly buy it. That was prisons, habitual drug users, sex workers, anyone frankly willing to sell their blood for cash. Of course, those groups all at the highest risk of carrying blood-borne viruses, and particularly HIV. This was the 70s and 80s when little was known about HIV, and of course it became a huge public health scare, and one that the government here and around the world struggled to get a handle on immediately. So these people were all infected in the 70s and 80s. Thousands have gone on to die. What we discovered, courtesy of some Cabinet Office papers previously unseen and unearthed by one of the campaigners, a man called Jason Evans, whose father died when he was just 4 years old, having contracted HIV and hepatitis from a blood product that he was given. He discovered these Cabinet papers. That was that's the bundle they came in. They're marked with Treasury as Treasury papers. Jason had been searching for these for several years, trying to persuade the government to put them on the public record in the National Archives. When they finally arrived, after he tracked them down, showing relentless desire to get to the truth of what happened to his father, they contained this, which is a Cabinet memo from a meeting of the 1987 Cabinet Home and Social Affairs Committee Subcommittee on AIDS. That was a pretty high-powered group put together under the chairmanship of Willie Whitelaw, a key aide and confidant of Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister in 1987, and included some of the biggest names in the Conservative government of the day were members of that committee, including Douglas Hurd, the Home Secretary at the time, Norman Fowler, Ken Baker, the Education Secretary, Kenneth Clarke, Father of the House now, back then was a junior minister, Malcolm Rifkind, then Scottish Secretary. They were all on this Cabinet committee looking at all sorts of issues about how the government should deal with AIDS. The significance of this memo was written by a man called John Moore, who was Social Security Secretary at the time, a rising star in the Conservative Party whose star waned very rapidly, perhaps in part because of the failure to deal with this challenge. In this memo which he wrote, he says that the Cabinet Committee accepted that the message that was being put across by the campaigners, which was that this was essentially the government's fault. If Britain had been self-sufficient in blood products, that is, had made its own blood products, no one would ever have been infected with these infected, contaminated blood sources. He says, he writes here, whilst unfair, this is difficult to refute convincingly in presentational terms. Now, campaigners look at that and they say, well, that's an acceptance, effectively, that they were right and the government has been wrong all along to claim it was not the government's fault. Later on, Mr Moore writes, when he's discussing a potential financial support package, not compensation, because the government has always said it is not liable for this, but financial support to be administered via a charity. He said one of the reasons this was attractive is because it would be consistent with the policy of not accepting any direct responsibility for damage caused. Now, again, the campaigners' families of those who lost their lives look at this and say, well, the government back in 1987, 30 years ago, was setting out a deliberate policy of distancing itself from responsibility, saying it had nothing to do with them, but doing it in private in confidential documents that then remain confidential for 30 years, this surely supports their case that there was a cover-up. Now, we have asked to speak to some of the people who were on that committee today. We've approached many of them, and they have all been unavailable for interview. One minister of the day, who is usually reasonably media-friendly, said he wasn't saying no because he didn't want to, but he simply couldn't remember anything of it. But there are ministers who one would expect would remember details, not least Ken Clarke, who went on to become Health Secretary, and campaigners have raised questions about his role subsequently. He has not wished to talk about it, and we have little choice but to respect that decision. I've got some questions here. People asking which ministers were involved. Well, I've given you a few of them already, but the memo was written by John Moore, the Social Security Secretary of the time. The committee, David Mellor was then a minister in the Foreign Office. He was on the committee. Willie Whitelaw, I've mentioned, who was central to Margaret Thatcher's administration. Douglas Hurd, the Home Secretary. Peter Walker, the Welsh Secretary. George Younger from Defence. This wide-ranging ministers from right across government reflects both the importance of AIDS as an issue, a health issue the government needed to get across and deal with, but also the UK-wide scale of this. Malcolm Rifkind, who was Scottish Secretary, Tom King, another well-known figure of the day, the Northern Ireland Secretary at the time, he was on the committee, but as I say, none of them willing to talk today, and some of them unusually reluctant to appear on camera. Question, will anyone go to prison for this? Good question, one. It's very difficult to answer at this stage. I think there's some parallels you can draw with the way that the inquiry into the Hillsborough disaster proceeded here. Similarly, there was a tragic event, although it should be said this blood scandal is many times worse in terms of the fatalities. 96 people died at Hillsborough, 2,400 people have been killed to date because of contaminated blood. The families at Hillsborough spent years campaigning for a genuine, effective inquiry. The blood families have done the same. They have been promised an inquiry by the Prime Minister. 3 months ago she said it would happen. We're yet to get any details on who will chair it or when it will happen or even what the terms of reference are. Once you have an inquiry that can perhaps establish what went wrong and who might have been responsible, then you might be looking at criminal accountability, but I think that is some way down the line, and the families in the first instance would just like, after a very long wait, to get to the truth before they can turn their attention to justice. How can the victims or their families get compensation? Well, there have been financial packages agreed in the past. They've never been called compensation, accepted as such by the families, because the government has never accepted liability, and to be compensation it needs to be recompense for a wrong that is someone's accepted they committed. But there have been financial support packages. The meeting I was referring to agreed a £10 million support package, which was going to be about £7,000 for each family that I'd identified at that time, administered via the Haemophiliacs Society. In the 1990s, there was a much bigger financial package agreed, which is around £60,000 to victims' families, but anyone who accepted it had to waive their rights to any future legal action. Some did that and accepted the money, but some of them have joined what is underway now, which is a huge group litigation. More than 500 victims or their families have joined together and are suing the Department of Health and the government for negligence. Effectively, they have been granted leave by the High Court to begin that action. First hearing is expected in the new year. And some of those who took money in the past said they simply didn't know all the facts when they agreed to waive their rights, and they're now seeking legal action. So that may be one route to compensation. People asking, how did Sky get these documents? Well, they've been unearthed. The hard work really is not done by us. It was done by a very committed campaigner, a man called Jason Evans, who has founded one of several campaigning groups. This is called Tainted Blood, and he has been badgering, hounding the Cabinet Office and others to release all the documents they hold on this issue. There's been a great deal of resistance. It has taken years of persistence for documents to be handed over. The government said earlier this year that it has now, it believes, put all the documentation it has on the public record at the National Archive at Kew. In fact, Mr Evans has been back and cross-referenced the documents that they say should be there with the ones that are actually there. He believes there are still thousands of documents to emerge, and I have no doubt that he will continue seeking to get those documents on the public record, and with any luck we'll be able to take a look at them when that happens. So that's about all the questions and about all we can say for now. This is a story that I don't expect to go away. I think it will continue to grow in interest. It's one of those stories, a huge scandal, almost hidden in plain view. The sheer scale of this unfolding over time means that there is no one place, there's no one image, there's no one event, unlike a Hillsborough or the horrendous recent horrors of Grenfell Tower. There's no one place or one event that sums up what happened, but it doesn't lessen in any way its impact on the families. And once the public inquiry starts to come underway, I suspect many more very, very troubling details of the impact on people's lives of this scandal, but also some extremely troubling facts about the way the government responded or didn't respond are going to come to light. Thank you.